Alrighty, so here we are at day two of writing my nonfiction book. Uh, the video for yesterday is up. I guess, I hopefully it's visible. Anybody wants to see it. I'm still trying to figure out this YouTube live stuff. Um, Basically, what we've got here is the first very rambly video. Was laying out the groundwork of the idea of what I was trying to do here is take from idea to purchasable book online in as few days as possible while still covering this nonfiction topic that I've chosen as well as I can. I'm hoping, and it looks like I could get pretty far into this. Came across some surprises doing the research as I was getting ready for this. Was the premise of the book is I guess the working title I'm going with right now is How to Know When You're Wrong and What to Do About It. Um, and so I wanted to go with moral wrongs. Um, I was looking into biases and logical fallacies. And boy, oh boy, did I hit some. Well, anyway, I was looking at the research, and so for biases, like I came across a list of uh, all the biases known, and it's easily over 100. And looking in on the logical fallacies, there's the formal fallacies, which rank about, I think it was 16. But then there are informal fallacies and a few other types of fallacies that uh, easily add another 100. And there's some philosophical discussion of approaches to moral wrongs. Um, it's kind of interesting, but oftentimes people, find flaws in the arguments by a previous accepted model on those realms. But the one I'm very curious about recently was a look at a very simple list of universally found. It's sort of like they went looking through all the models and um, all the cultures they could find to find what the universal um, aspects are, and uh, built a system which matched those categories. And so they came across with, I think they had like a one, two, three, and four. Four had sections A, B, and C, maybe a D. And um, so that one, if I just went with that one, and I don't usually like to go with a single source, so I'm inclined to kind of go look at like social and moral taboos and see which ones are more universal in application, and maybe look at some of the legal stuff. But I imagine I can get somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 max in the moral wrongs category. Um, Sorting the biases and the fallacies might be a little more tricky. And I did notice that in some of the bias, like a sunk cost, uh, is sort of both a bias. You're more likely to um, continue to hold out on something that you've invested something in and you want to regain that investment. That's a bias, but it's also a fallacy. it's not reasoned on logic to imagine that I've been keeping these things in storage for 40 years and it cost me $112 when I bought it and I want to get my money back. You're paying more in storage fees than you will ever get back. If you sold it for $20, you spent 100 and something dollars on it. You're not going to get the full price. You don't even hold out for 2/3 of the price because it makes more sense to sell it before it costs you more to store it than you paid to get it in the first place and then you'll ever get from selling it. So it's a fallacy, but it's also a bias. So there may be some overlap between the two of them, and I'm debating whether or not um, I have to find a way to make them pick a side, or if I want to do an overlap chapter where any of the ones that fit both go in the middle between them. Um, but as I'm looking at this, the doing like 100 bias and 100 over 100, maybe 120 fallacies, and then 20 universal moral wrongs. And section 1 is like wrongs do not mean bad. What does wrong mean? Personal versus universal wrongs. Fear of being wrong, and the right way to be wrong. The section on don't aim for perfection. Recognize that there will be something wrong with what you're doing, but there's a time to use what is wrong versus aiming for perfection. So that first section, I think I could probably bring down to almost like a preface, preface, um, maybe 7 to 10 pages. Universal moral wrongs, I could see doing 20 pages on that one, 20 to 30. But if I did the bias section with 2 to 3 biases per page for that section, and the fallacies with 2 to 3 fallacies per page, I think I could get to a book that's 200 to 300 pages long. If I include everything, and that would be an exhaustive work on the logical and the moral and the bias and how to handle and adopt them. So doing that, building the list, I think I'm going to potentially do it that way. Each topic will get. I'll have to sort them so that they can be in sort of families, I think. Things that are very similar to one another. And then each one will have a definition, an illustrative example, ways to identify it when you're potentially in it without knowing it, and ways to address it. I mean, it's not necessarily that you will, like, specifically with biases, you're always going to have a bias. Any research you do is going to tend towards a certain bias. Now, you can play one bias off of another to help with a greater understanding of the topic you're looking at. So any study that you do to see what kind of TV programs that somebody watches is going to run into the bias of um, you're going to get your answers from the surveys that you do. Um, it's going to have like a selection bias because it's self-filtering in a certain way. The only people who are going to answer those surveys uh, aren't going to necessarily be the same population. It's not going to be an even representation of everybody. It's mainly going to be the people who like to take surveys and like to help assist gather data on uh, uh, recreational practices of populations. Um, Not everybody has the time or cares or um, is the target demographic for certain things. So you're going to get wonky data. Now, you could do that study in, like, I don't imagine you're going to get a lot of teenagers who want to be part of that study. You're more likely to get people over the age of 50, and many of them going to be retired people. And so the data is going to skew. Um, Now, you could do another parallel study of um, TV viewing habits of teenagers with a different model of surveying. And you will get a different set of data from some of that stuff. And by sort of syncing that data, tearing that data out against each other, you can get perhaps a better understanding, but it's always going to be piecemeal. It's going to be assembled differently in different situations. So there's always going to be a bias that we. That's a long rambling way of saying there's always going to be some bias, and um, how to account for that in arguments or data collection or research, and how to identify which ones you're in. So I feel like with each bias or each fallacy or each moral wrong, it would be important to, identifying characteristics, the history and sort of definition of that wrong, and then sort of like, here are ways you can check to see if this is affecting your argument in any given situation, and ways to avoid it if you can. And if you can't avoid having that be a factor in your arguments, ways to take its effect into account when making your argument. Um, and so I think being able to do sort of like a monsters gallery of these different wrongs, and do the, how to see it, how to recognize it when you see it, what it actually is, and what its abilities are, what its impact is, and how to take that into account when trying to achieve something. And so it's almost like a recipe card. To a certain degree, it's got me thinking right now, almost like each one of these is almost like a Pokemon at this point. Um, so if you build this master list of these, do one or two per page, sorted to sort of families of categories of these. And then sort of like an illustrative example. And I think that's probably the best way to approach this. This is still going to be a pretty substantial. I mean, I might be able to narrow things down enough to the point where I could do one per page, give each topic its own page, and it would still be a 200 to 300 page book. But um, for each one of these things, yeah, I'll have to build and sort out the entire list in the next 24 hours and come up with like roughly, like whether or not I want to do a full page per or like 2 to 3 per page. I think 3 per page sounds too high a number per page because at that point it sort of becomes like a dictionary, and I don't really want it to be a dictionary per se. I want it to be more a handy resource for understanding how to recognize when you're wrong. And it's not like, oh, well, let me look up the definition of this wrong. I want it to be how to know when you're wrong. And I want you to be able to look through it and say, like, I'm making an argument about politics, and um, being able to say, like, in this argument that I'm making, am I begging the question, or am I leading with uh, optimism bias, or um, am I making an argument that is based off of a personal moral value and not a universal moral value? So, am I applying a personal value as if it were um, the true value of right and wrong in this scenario? And I want you to be able to, say, like, okay, I'm forming an argument and I'm talking about a topic like politics. Here's my argument. Let me take a look through this book and see if my argument is likely to have some bias or fallacies, and therefore sort of risk um, being seen as wrong. I mean, like I said, you're not going to be able to escape any biases. And I mean, ideally, you don't want to be using any fallacies. Um, and you might be able to cross personal or universal values. So um, it's it's being able to say, like, okay, I want to go through the moral wrongs section and see what I can find out about the categories of those and where mine might fall into a trap, and whether or not I'm holding other people to a standard that is not necessarily a wrong, but is it pokes holes in my argument that somebody coming from a different perspective will be able to see it as a wrong, and how to take that into account when I'm making my argument. Um, with a bias, being able to say, like, okay, I know it's likely that what I'm doing has some kind of bias, and be able to make that statement in your argument in the hopes that more information or a different perspective could potentially lead to better understanding your argument or proving or disproving more of your point. Um, Now, fallacies, you do kind of want to be able to go through it and say, like, okay, I know I'm making an argument from a perspective that um, somebody else is likely to disagree with. Is there a chance that there is validity in their um, opposition to certain points because I'm making an argument that's aff- affirming a disjunct, concluding that one disjunct of a logical disjunct must be false because the other disjunct is true. I'm reading that as an example here. But, like, is it possible that's something I'm doing? So it's not in my goal to be, oh, let me look up in alphabetical order what is a illicit major. That, nobody's going to be looking through that. That's not a useful tool. Categorizing things in a way that makes them applicable to forming sound arguments and arguments that can appeal to the understanding and the perspective of people who are not within your main group. And you're not going to achieve that by looking through a category, alphabetical list or a glossary of terms. That's just not my approach. I want to be able to say, like, this is a tool, sort of like the writer's manual, where you go through and you like, oh, these are the parts of speech, and these are useful for me to be able to structure my sentences and grammar appropriately for a quality written piece. I want to be able to do something similar for um, making arguments as factual and applicable as possible while managing the biases and avoiding the fallacies that can undermine any argument that you might make. So that's sort of where I am right now. Um, I'm still at that point where the hard decision for me at this point is deciding if I'm going to do 100, 100 fallacies. I'm going to do just the formal fallacies or informal ones and a few of the other categories, like propositional fallacies, existential fallacies. Do I want to chase down all the different categories and the huge numbers? I mean, for a lot of this, uh, just making the list of all of them, getting the definition for each list, that's just data mining. That's collection. You find 1 to 3 sources for each one to get a kind of an evened out source of roughly what each one represents and what the lists are. Not all lists of fallacies include all the same ones. So um, building that list, putting a definition for each one, and then sometimes 3 definitions for one, and then kind of marinate them together until you can get one that concisely explains what it is, and then how to recognize that it's how to find it in your argument and what to do once you've found it, because you may not be able to eliminate it entirely. um, uh, Sampling bias is something that, like, it's really hard to escape in a study. There's always a point at which you can look at what you've done and say, like, is it possible that our sample isn't broad enough? You can split hairs until your sample sizes are 7 billion people, and that still may not be enough because there may be other ways of viewing this, and yeah, it's unreasonable to expect to get to that point, but to be able to say, like, given the sample size we have now, this is the data that we have. This is what we can do with it, and until such time as there is an argument counter to this, um, this seems to be the best approach to this argument. Being able to say, like, I can recognize that potentially there's a sampling bias. I can recognize that there's potentially a placebo effect or an anti-placebo effect where you're convinced it won't work and something that should work doesn't work because you've convinced yourself it doesn't. You know, being able to say, you know, those being situations that we cannot account for all the eventualities. This is the best data we have going forward, and how to make that realization about all the biases that you can encounter. And you know, part of that one of those biases is to be able to say, like, I am me, and therefore there may be fallacies that I'm operating within that I'm not aware of because my bias as me can only see that part of things that I'm able to see. Somebody with a different perspective can probably see some of the flaws in what I'm saying. And so, how to account for that when you're writing something or making a speech or taking a stance on a topic. Um, but yeah, I'm sort of rambling again. But being able to build that, and then I do still want to have like a flash fiction short story example for each one. And I think that happens best if each topic gets its own page. But that's a question of um, whether or not I can find a way to do less than 300 individual topics. I mean, right now the sections are going to be section one, which is the wrongs don't mean bad, all the way through the right way to be wrong, uh, kind of essays, and then the rest of it's going to be the like section two should be the universal moral wrongs, and section three would be biases, and section four would be um, fallacies. Now, it's possible to do 5 sections, where the section between 3 and 4 in this list would actually be biases that are fallacies and fallacies that are biases. But I feel like it makes more sense to just give them one home and maybe give a special marker to indicate that it is also a fallacy as well as a bias. Um, yeah, so that's sort of where I am. Again, I'm not sure I'm doing this YouTube live thing particularly well. I will probably try to do some outreach to a few people and see if I can get a more participatory. But aside from that, even if nobody else shows up for the chat in the side, I'm still going to archive these. And if you watch this in the archive or see this update, uh, you are welcome to join me, ask any questions, or offer suggestions in the chat. I appreciate any participation people want to take in this. And I suppose I will probably be back tomorrow. My goal is to try to do an update each day to see where I am and talk about the progress. This is day 2. I'm aiming for 7 days. I don't know that I'll be able to do 7 days. Depends on, like, I could probably compile a list of each one of the uh, universal morals, um, biases, and fallacies in the next 24 hours. And I could probably get definitions reasonably sorted out for each of them. I think at that point it would be, and I'll probably do some of this tomorrow while doing this, where I'll do a kind of identifying features, full explanation of what it is, and how to manage them. And the how to manage them might be one of the longer parts of that. I mean, if I'm doing 300 of these and I can roughly do 50 an hour, that's going to be a substantial amount of video content. And so I'm not sure there's a market for me to be live for 3 to 5 hours compiling that data. Um, so I don't know that that makes as much sense. But if somebody's willing to sit and talk about that, watch me work on that, that's fine. I don't know how people do this. I don't know that anybody does this. I think I'm the only freaking lunatic who's going to be doing write a book in a week through YouTube Live. But the idea of doing individual story examples for each one, and we figure 300 to 400 topics. That's a lot. That's a lot. I have to leave myself time to edit. And I kind of want to get some beta readers. So I might do a spell check, a quick read through, a grammar check, and then see if I can get a beta reader. Get a few beta readers, and I'm hoping to say day 4. That I will put time into starting the editing process of it. So I'll give myself 2 more days to do the writing and composition of it. That's super ambitious. But if I fail, I can give myself a few more days. I don't want to, but I could do it. Nobody else is setting that deadline on me, just me. All right, so here's hoping. I will see you tomorrow. Hopefully by tomorrow I will have a couple hundred pages of material to clean up. Yeah, I didn't realize the size of this project when I got started, but I'm kind of enjoying the fact that this isn't going to be a small project, but it's achievable in a short enough period of time. I mean, if I end up doing this over the course of just a month, that's fine. I don't want to do a video every day of the month, but I can give progress reports on that. Editing may end up editing, and beta reader may end up being something I do past the first week if it goes as big as I think it's going to be. Alrighty, well, I guess I will see you guys tomorrow.